episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast.
The idea to cross the ape man with the Annunaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person, to unburden the gods.
Here, thank you so much for joining. I'm so sorry that our final episode has to be like this. Excellent. Richard, good to see you here. I don't think I've seen you before. Welcome. Excellent episode to join us on, despite the shaky starts. Archangel Gabriel, thank you for coming. Patient Zero, as always. Thank you all for joining, and I hope that from here will be smooth sailing. Vaccines cause avian flu. Thank you very much for joining as well. Hi, good to see you here. So, let's just get started. Yes, the timing is different all over. Here it's 11 o'clock. I think in a lot of places there's, early morning. But I appreciate you very much for joining nonetheless. And as you probably know, I assume those who are here, this is an exciting episode, the culmination of our Sitchin Anunnaki Sumer series. And this is the one where all of the questions that haven't been answered yet, all the things that have been floating around that you didn't get a chance or remembered after an episode or whatever, now is the chance to ask all of those questions. And in case none of you have any questions of your own, I have brought a few of my own questions as well that we can get into. But honestly, also, we'll see how the episode goes. We'll see how much time we have. I have a few things regarding next episode as well, a little bit of an introduction. So we'll see how it goes. But for now, let's get started. So as I go through, please feel free to write any questions that you have in chat if you would like, if you think of anything, and I will try and get to them all before the end of the episode. So we'll start off with a specific question that was asked about last week's episode and in general, and sort of what we spoke about in the last episode. So I think that's a good place to start. And the question was, who was Nergal? And the bit with the Alalu and the missiles wasn't entirely clear now. I did go over a lot of information last episode. I was trying to sort of cram it into the last one. So let's elaborate a little bit over that and see where we get to. So Nergal, as we'd mentioned a while back, I can't remember which episode exactly, is one of Enki's sons. He is a younger son of, the younger brother of Dumuzi, and so obviously of Marduk as well. And he has an interesting relationship. He was in Africa and one of the gods over there. I'll give it a try, Rondon. And he wasn't a very big character, and that's why we didn't mention him as much. Obviously, in the different cultures that worshipped him, he has a lot more background, but Sitchin specifically doesn't go too much into his character. The first mentioning that we said was when he was the one who was sent to Marduk the first time to convince him to step down and to leave his temple in Babylon, which he succeeded to do. And then Nergal was the one responsible for removing the sacred stone, the sacred gem, as it were, and destroying the water system there. So his character in general is not as big as some of the other names that we've followed, even Dumuzi and such. But that's his basic placement in the Anunnaki pantheon and the Enki tribe, as it were. Okay. The other question was regarding Alalu and the nuclear missiles that suddenly appeared. Now, when Sitchin goes over the story, in the very, very beginning, when Alalu first lands, he mentions that aboard the spacecraft there were these nuclear missiles. Since they were a big problem, they were a huge danger that had to be sort of dealt with and hidden. And so there's mention of what they had done with it. They decided to store them away in a secret mountain that no one was aware of the location in order to protect them and in order to prevent anything of this sort happening, at least without the agreement of all the Anunnaki. And so it's a sort of crucial piece of information that's only mentioned in the beginning of the story, and thousands of years pass before it actually becomes relevant to the story. So I decided not to go too deeply into it in the beginning and to instead save it for when it actually becomes relevant. So just to recap a little bit so we can remember more or less the timeline, the first Anunnaki to come, Alalu, was the former king on Nibiru, who was dethroned by Anu. And when he was exiled, he decided to escape. And so he stole one of the spacecrafts from Nibiru and he left. And as Sitchin describes it, although this isn't exactly mentioned in the texts, but his understanding is that Alalu had heard or remembered from ancient myths in Nibiru that there was a planet in the solar system which contained gold, which was what the Anunnaki needed in order to repair their atmosphere. And so that is the reason he pointed the aircraft to Earth. And in the recap of his journey, he mentions that he actually fires one of the missiles at the asteroid belt in order to break away to get through. And so that's the sort of first mention of these awesome weapons. And then as he arrives on Earth, he doesn't do anything with them yet. And he first contacts Nibiru, and then Enki arrives with a party. And once Enki arrives, one of the first orders of business Alalu talks to him about are the missiles and the need to hide them somewhere and to store them so that they won't be used. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Alalu and the nuclear missiles and how they actually got there to begin with. So, do any of you have any questions? If not, I have a few questions from the posts that I'd sent, and these were the ones that I sort of wanted to go over. But yeah, we'll start from them and we'll see. So, the first question, which is more, I think, general, and probably we feel we have quite a good understanding, the question of who were the Anunnaki. And so we've described as Sitchin describes, which is a very impersonal and very research sort of guided answer, which is they were extraterrestrials, beings who came from outside of Earth. They were genetically similar they are genetically similar to human beings, and this was because of the seeding of the planet Earth, which was done when Nibiru collided with Earth all those years ago. And so this explains the genetic similarity and the way they could do all of the experiments. But there is more to that question of who were they on a grander scale, or who were they specifically in terms of alien species, etc. So I'd like to just touch on it a little bit in this episode, since it seems appropriate and we can elaborate a little bit more about who they were. And hopefully this will actually carry over to the next series as well, when we go a little bit deeper into the various races and how they interact with human beings, etc. So in the Sitchin story, there is only one race of aliens, as it were, and that is the Anunnaki. And all subsequent races, which we sort of term as demigods, were the offspring of either the Anunnaki and the humans mating, or some kind of experiment, biological, genetic experiment to create new beings. And there's a lot of talk of this in different cultures, but that's the Sitchin's world's view as to who these Anunnaki were, what race they were. In recent years, and more, I think, lately, there's been a lot of talk of different races of aliens, and all of those stories are much more modern, and they relate to, well, not all of them, but more modern than Sitchin's timeline, I should say. And a lot of that story seems to originate from the story of Atlantis. Now, for those who haven't gone very deep down the Atlantis rabbit hole, we're not going to get too thick into it today, because that's not the point. Although it's a fascinating story, we're going to go into it more in the following episodes. But that seems to be the first mention in history of interactions between different races of aliens. So the names which are given to the races of aliens that I think are the most famous today are probably the reptilians, which are the first and most famous, I think. There are Martians, which are obviously the beings that come from Mars. There are Draconians, I think that's what they're called, from sorry, not the planet Draco, the star system Draco. And there are Palladians, which are from the other star system. And there are another kind, which are called Greys, which don't seem to originate from the Atlantis story. They're even more modern, more connected with stories of UFO sightings, UFO abductions, and that sort of thing. So, where do the Anunnaki fit into all this? How can it be that we've got certain beings coming from a very specific planet, Nibiru, which as yet is not recognized, and then we have all of these other beings coming from much farther away? So to answer this question, we need to touch on a crucial point, and I think we're going to get into this a bit more in the following episodes, but we'll start a little bit now just to answer this question as best I can. Atlantis kicks ass. Absolutely. I agree. I had a long period of studying Atlantis, and obviously the first mentioning in Western civilization was Plato. So it goes very far back, and he heard about it from an Egyptian priest who told him the story. I can't remember his name right now. But interestingly enough, it does trace back to the Anunnaki cultures, or the cultures that spoke of these gods as well. So there is an overlap in there. But regarding the race of the Anunnaki, in Sitchin's description, it is absolutely and 100% physical. And so in all of his mentions, even with the unbelievable feats that the Anunnaki managed to do, he never goes into anything too abnormal. It's all explained through they had the technology, and it was, scientific, as we know, common physical technology that could be explained and reproduced. And he stays very, very clear from anything that is, metaphysical, as in above the physical level. And this is where I want to talk about the word dimensions, because it's a crucial concept for us to understand in dealing with any of these stories, really. Even when we talk about, the speed that they had to go from Nibiru to us, the amount of years that they live, all of these things are very important to understand. Now, the word dimensions is a word that appears, I think, in many different realms, and it can all mean different things. We have mathematical dimensions, which is sort of, I'm not a mathematician at all, but they are constructs, as it were, theoretical planes that you can use to manipulate different relationships in mathematics, in maths. So I'm not talking about that. Now, there might be a problem with the word dimension, so I'm going to define it the way that Drunvalo Melchizedek does, since that's what we're going to be talking about. When he talks about dimensions, it's not first dimension, second dimension, third dimension, in that basic geometric conception that we're taught, where sort of a spot, a dot, is one dimension, and then a line is 2 dimensions, and a plane is 2 dimensions, and then if you add depth to that, that's a third dimension. And then what is the fourth dimension? It's hard for us to imagine. What we're actually talking about is more similar, in the terms at least, to what we would call frequencies. And so if we'll use the radio analogy, which is a very useful one for us to have, or television, we have a certain frequency, and there is a broadcasting of some information on that frequency. Now, we can call that frequency a dimension. And so on the radio receiver, we tune it to be the same harmonic, as it were, with that frequency, and then we can hear the information, or see it if it's television. This is the kind of concept of dimensions that I'm talking about. Different levels, different frequencies of reality. And all of these are existing simultaneously, as it were, overlapping, But in the same way that radio frequencies don't disturb each other, in the same way these all can coexist at the same time without there being any interaction. Now, this is more to understand what we're talking about. I'm not specifically saying that there is a frequency for each dimension, but it's a metaphor for us to understand what I'm trying to say. So, when we think of it in this way, we can talk about the reality that we know. And we can see that human beings are tuned to a certain kind of frequency, to a certain kind of reality. And that reality is really bound mainly by our physical senses. So our eyes can see a certain spectrum of light, our ears can hear a certain spectrum of electromagnetism, our bodies can feel the things that are strong enough, that are close enough to us, etc., etc. And so this spectrum that we are functioning on is our dimension. And there are other animals, as we know scientifically. I'm trying to keep this all as scientific as possible until now. We'll see when we veer off. But scientifically speaking, we know that certain animals can see different frequencies, can hear different frequencies, and others can't see and hear the frequencies that we do. So we have one reality, and we usually think of this reality as a singular that we're all experiencing together. But we can see by our biology and by the way that the world around us exists, that each of us is existing in a different part of that reality, and therefore interacting with it differently and having a different experience to begin with. So, if we think about dimensions, we can think about certain beings existing in a certain spectrum of reality, which can be different or the same as other beings. Now we get into what about changing dimensions? What about changing frequencies? So, I can see. Claybon, I saw your comment, and I'm going to mention it very quickly, but I'll just finish this thought first. I just really want to talk about about that subject. So we're not going to get too far into how, who, when, or what, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that there are certain beings, be they extraterrestrial or humans, who can at will or under their own control change the dimension, change the frequencies, the spectrum of reality that they exist in. What would that mean? Well, in very much the way that a radio works, if you are not receiving that frequency, you simply aren't aware of it. And so if someone was in one dimension, in one frequency, and then changed, they could very easily simply disappear. And that's what it would seem like for us. However, they wouldn't have really disappeared. They would simply have changed the dimension that they're experiencing on. Now, this is what's claimed to a certain degree that certain extraterrestrial races can do. One claim of this is scientific and technological, saying the UFOs, the actual flying saucers, when they appear and disappear, are sort of manifesting, are existing at a certain frequency, at a certain dimension, which corresponds to the light spectrum that we experience, and then we can see it. And when it travels, whether it's traveling faster than the speed of light or whether it's traveling some other technological way, it seems to leave this dimension and enter another one in order to travel, as it were. So that's talking about technological side. Shall I say, the spiritual side of it refers to the actual being changing. Now, I don't want to get into too deep into this subject, because we're going to go into it much more later on. So just for now, we'll leave it at that, and we'll say there is talk of, there are certain people who claim that these alien races were capable not only of using this technology for their spaceships, but also for their own physical body. And so whether it's traveling, to distant places, whether it's appearing, disappearing, being aware of what's going on, or without being seen, as it were, being invisible. And all of these are talks of what we hear that the gods were behaving like throughout the years. So a lot of these supernatural, metaphysical behaviors can actually be understood through this prism of dimensions and the use of changing dimensions at will. So, who were the Anunnaki? That was the original question. This is not Sitchin's. This is my personal or grander look at the thing and trying to see it in a larger scope. What I believe is that the Anunnaki were beings who came from this planet Nibiru, so they weren't one of the other alien races that are mentioned, but that their journey here was not merely a physical, third dimension scientific travel, but that in fact, both in crossing the solar system to arrive and indeed here on Earth, they weren't merely physical beings, they were beings who could change their physicality in one way or another. And so this alien race was described as being much, much larger than a lot of the other races, for example. And in fact, if you see the mention of, both giants throughout history, and there are various buildings whose dimensions are clearly for much larger beings, that is the claim that the Anunnaki were this giant race who was in fact spiritually much more advanced. And one of the reasons that it's mentioned, or one of the hypotheses, I should say, this is actually Gerald Clark's theory, was that Enki, specifically in both creating the human and then allowing them to reproduce, was actually doing more than just biologically changing the DNA, but was in fact improving, as it were, the spiritual faculty of the biological body. And specifically, Gerald Clark speaks a lot about what's known as the chakra system, which is actually the 7 nerve ganglions that are placed along the spine, that are found along the spine. I'm mentioning a lot of little things here. You don't have to remember it all, but in case you've heard of it, this sort of ties a lot of things together. Gerald Clark's claim is that Enki used the chakra system that was more advanced in the Anunnaki in order to help push the human beings forward, spiritually speaking. So again, this isn't something that Sitchin talks about at all, but in my personal view, from what I've heard about, these Anunnaki who came were actually spiritually advanced as well, and there was a split between whether to help the human beings or, as it were, to not interfere in these animals. And Enki's decision to help push it forward was not only a biological and DNA sort of upgrade, but actually a spiritual one as well. So that's a little bit more. I don't want to get too deep into those subjects, but we'll see. Okay, Claiborne, you had a question, and since you're here this morning, thank you so much for joining. I feel the need to answer. So I tend to think of lucid dreaming as exploring fourth dimension. I always wondered why I tend to observe myself in dreams instead of be myself. In dreams and over time, I've come to look at them as ways of exploring the subconscious and subliminal thoughts that exist inside myself. That's very interesting. I wouldn't care for a moment to to counter that, as it were. But I do have something else that I would like to add. It actually can relate very much to what we've just been talking about. I think I've experienced lucid dreaming once in my life. It was a very powerful experience, but that was years and years ago, and I've never had anything like it since. I don't really remember my dreams that much. But I have heard of a few people. One of them in particular, Bob Monroe was a leading researcher, and he actually started the Monroe Institute, which is specifically dedicated to studying lucid dreaming. If you haven't heard of them and you're interested, go check them out. The Monroe Institute. He was a businessman, and when he was around 40 something, he suddenly started having, he had chest pains or these very strange feelings of pressure. And eventually, after a while passed and no doctors could help with anything, and his friend mentioned something about this being an experience that some monks mention. Anyway, Robert Monroe was lying in bed one night asleep, and he woke up on the ceiling. And he wrote quite a few books about it, about his personal journey. He documented each one of his dreams, lucid dreams, and he actually calls them out-of-body experiences. And he does a very, very good and unique job, I think, of showing what it was like and really giving an outside view of what the experience was like for him. So again, he's not scientific. He doesn't explain anything. He simply gives his own personal experience of how he felt. And I think it's a very interesting book to read if you're interested in the subject. But with regards to the observation, and this is a tendency in lucid dreaming that you observe yourself. The claim that I have heard, which I personally believe today, is that lucid dreaming, that experience of being conscious of the dream, is actually it's the ethereal body. I was going to say soul, but we should be very clear with our terms here. The ethereal body, the lighter body, as it were, not the physical one, leaving the physical body. And that's why a lot of the time when people look, they see themselves from outside, since their point of view is now the ethereal body's point of view looking at the physical body from outside. Now, interesting point, since this is somewhat can be a frightening experience. If you ever have this, a lot of people suddenly feel that they won't be able to get back, or that it's something that won't change. There is what's described, I've never seen it obviously, but it's described as a very thin silver thread. And that thread connects your ethereal body to your physical body. And that is until death. And once you die and the ethereal and physical body disconnect, the physical body starts decaying and the ethereal body moves on, then that thread is no more. But until then, as it were, this is how the spirit, the ethereal body, can always find its way back to the physical body by retracing it. So when you have this lucid dream, to my understanding, you are leaving the physical body, and at that point you can do anything that is not bound by the third dimension, physicality. So you can go through walls, you can fly, you can appear in different places. You don't necessarily have to have a body. And very often people don't see their body until they think about it. And then when they look down, they find their body where it's supposed to be. Now, the reason for that is that since it's a conscious the ethereal body is actually part of ourselves, we can imagine seeing the body that we're used to seeing, even though it's not there. And so that creation, the appearance of a body, is not the physical body itself, but it's the self-image that we're conjuring up in order to make ourselves feel more at ease. The same way you stand on the floor. Technically, there wouldn't be anything to stop you from going through the floor, but since we are so used to these laws of the third dimension of physicality, we keep playing according to them, even in our dreams. And the reason I mention all of this, because there is word. I mean, most of the people whom I've personally met who've had lucid dreams were not training, and even if they were, they weren't very experienced. They didn't seem to be really, gurus of the subject, as it were. A lot of the times it first happens without trying, just by, just happens. And why I mention that is because there are people who use this as a spiritual technique. And so lucid dreaming is not just a sort of fun, casual thing that you can fly around and read books, but it's actually a spiritual practice that they use to, advance themselves and to do their spiritual work at the same time. Okay, there are a lot of things going on in chat, so let me just go into it very quickly and we will carry on. Patient Zero says, I think the difference between lucid dreaming and out-of-body experiences are in the former, you are dreaming and simply aware that you are dreaming, and in the latter, you have the sensation that you've left your sleeping body. But Clay seems to be dreaming in the third person and also lucid dreaming. Right. The experience that I had was exactly what you explained, and that is, that should be called actually lucid dreaming. You're right. I wasn't outside my body. I didn't see myself. I really saw a dream, but it was like a film. It was like watching a film play out. And so I saw the character that was me, but
he was doing all of these things and running and moving, but it wasn't memories. It was a dream that was happening because of the way that it was happening, and it was a crazy story. But I watched the whole thing unfold. I couldn't control any of it. I couldn't, stop or start or do anything. But I was aware that it wasn't reality, that it wasn't really happening, unlike most of my dreams. So yeah, when you're experiencing it and you can't control it, you can't change anything, that's normally lucid dreaming. Whereas when you're in a body of some sort, you're controlling it, you're deciding what you want to do, that's more an out-of-body experience. Well said, Patient Zero, I agree. Richard says he was scientific. He is Rob Monroe, I assume. He was an engineer and constructed the hemisync process to help induce out-of-body experiences. The TMI also hides a lot of its research. Absolutely. That is, I heard of the hemisync process, but I heard of that from a different institute. He was the first one to do that. I didn't know that. Oh. That CIA document written by Army Intel about the hemisync process was really interesting, yeah, but didn't know how much of it was legit. Well, who knows how much of anything is legit these days, especially. Okay, talking about that, I just realized I was doing it one day, and then I started realizing how often I do it. No flying, I have scene shifted, if that makes sense. Scene shifted means you move from one place to another without going through linear space, as it were. Okay. So it depends whether you look down on yourself. There's a free range of motion. Like the dream is showing me what I need to see, so the angles can vary greatly. Sometimes it will even shift to first person. When I lucid dream, I don't try to control it or make things happen. I just observe and let it show me what it needs to show me. You know what? That is probably the best thing to do, and that's what I've heard personally from most people. When there is an attempt, or most people I know wake up from the excitement once they realize. So it's like, oh my God, I'm dreaming, I can't believe it, and then that wakes them up. So yes, the best thing with a lot of these experiences is to sort of take a step back, calm down, and see where it takes you and what happens, and remember that it can't harm you in that sense. Wow. Okay, not quite on the topic of the Anunnaki, but actually somewhat, since out-of-body experiences is related. So there's another wonderful book that I have to mention. It's a very little and unknown book. I can't actually remember exactly what it's called. It was from 1917, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it's called The Guru Teaches of... I can't remember now. I'll have to look it up. Remind me. I'll have to look it up for next week. But it's a book of a group of mountaineers, researchers, who went to visit and stay with, was it Nepalese monks? I think it was Nepalese. Oh, Tibetan. It was Tibetan monks. A group of 7 Tibetan monks for 2 weeks. And during these 2 weeks, these Tibetan monks, all they wanted to do was to show this team of researchers, what they quote unquote could do. What we term, supernatural and all these things. But for the Tibetan monks, this was part of the known practices that people have been doing for thousands of years, and there really wasn't anything unusual about it for them. The reason I like this book so much, I've read a lot of books about all kinds of crazy shit that people can do, and I've seen videos, and there's a lot of information. But A, this is very old. B, which I think, in 1917, nobody was talking about that. No one who took themselves seriously would risk their reputation with talking about these things. There was a big movement in the end of the 19th century, but as the World War was nearing and the situation politically was coming worse, that sort of died out in favor of, survival. So when someone who is credible comes and decides to say these things, and to this extreme, for me it sounds much more legitimate than somebody talking about things that they managed to do a long time ago. And I won't go over everything that they talk about because there's a lot, but one of the things they mention is their ability to basically what we call teleport, which is that they take a group and they leave one person behind with a monk, and they tell the group to start walking, and they go and walk for a day. And when they get to a specific place, they tell the other guy to look at the clock and to as watch and to remember what time it was. The monk tells him.
And then the monk teleports, disappears. And then the person comes and he tells them at what time he last saw the monk. And the group of people saw him a minute later, hundreds of kilometers away. I hope that was understandable. What this has to do is that, according to these Tibetan monks, who obviously are practicing these spiritual techniques for many, many years and are very proficient, they claim that the out-of-body experience is sort of part of what's capable. And that's the first half, as it were. The second part would be, so first you can leave your physical body, and then you can manifest the physical body elsewhere. And so that's the way that they talked about it. I'm not going to say if there's other ways to teleport, but they leave their physical body. They then can appear with the ethereal body, far away in no time. And from there, they can sort of not animate, but actually, bring their physical body with them to be there as well. And this is a separate technique from what they explain. One of them is that you can actually leave the body and come back to it. And they use these two techniques for different things. So when we talk about out-of-body experiences, once again, when it's this, not to not to sound too demeaning, but the Western experiences in general are very childlike, I feel, because we have no context. We have no historical understanding of any of these things, whether it's psychedelics, supernatural abilities, alien races. All of these are spoken about in texts from thousands of years ago, with a whole cosmological worldview to go with it and to explain it. And for Westerners, when we usually take psychedelics for the first time, it's in an awful setting. It's definitely not a spiritual setting. We definitely don't feel that it's sacred. Most of us, at least. I think in Western society, the same when it comes to aliens, when it's an abduction, when it's all these things, it's never a spiritual moment. It's never part of a practice. It's very much a frightening, event that happens to me rather than me letting it happen. So I think that we have a lot to learn in general about all of these things from the more ancient techniques and people who have been really doing and studying this for a long, long time. Okay, wow, it's now 11:40. We haven't gone very far into it, but I'm having a good time. I hope you're all enjoying it as well. And I think this is actually a great introduction to the coming episodes, a bit more of my speed. Okay, let me just very quickly riff through chat because I think, okay. What do you think of the lost Atlantis being situated where the Azores Islands are right now? Well, I'm very near the Azores Islands, so I would be very happy if that turned out to be true. Yeah, where Atlantis is a difficult one. I've heard very strong evidence about Antarctica being Atlantis, underwater imaging, etc., and many other things. I mean, I've actually read a book about people traveling to the Bermuda Triangle, which they say is part of the sunk Atlantis, in order to perform a ritual there. So, I mean, either crazy or serious, but definitely people who are out there in a boat in the sea going to. So I'm not sure about the location. Honestly, I would be hard pressed to say. I'd say I know much more about the history and the culture that was on Atlantis than I know where it was on Earth. Because let's not forget that not only, I mean, when we're talking about these things, the Earth itself has changed, and the lands that were around back then have changed tremendously. So when it comes to finding where things are now, it becomes much, much harder. That's not to say that we don't know or that it can't be found, and I would put my bets more into non-scientific methods of discovering, personally. But as for whether it is in the Azores, I really couldn't say for sure. I hope. I'll go and check. So only 12,000 years ago. The Atlantis? Well, again, this is a difficult question. There are many different answers. Since we're entering Drunvalo, will use his timeline, and he mentions around 35,000 years ago. But again, this was a long period of time. So 12,000 years ago, from what I understood, wasn't the same calamity that sunk Atlantis to begin with, although it was still a calamity, and the Atlantean civilization that survived dealt with the deluge from 12,000 years ago. So again, there's a lot of sort of crossovers and a lot of threads to untangle. But yes, Drunvalo mentions 35,000 years ago, which is, approximately double, more or less. They didn't predict climate change. Who? The Atlanteans. They didn't predict the fall of their civilization, let alone thousands of years later. I personally, I don't want to sound the wrong way, but I have very little, I want to say respect, but maybe that's not the word. But I really feel that all of these races, societies, peoples, etc., are lacking terribly, each to their own. But I feel personally that as humans, we shouldn't be striving to replicate not the Anunnaki nor the Atlanteans, but to improve and to step forward from where they were. Personally, I think that both the Anunnaki and the Atlanteans had a lot to do with the human evolution, spiritually speaking. I think that it played a big part, a big role in where we are today. But I feel that today, in this day and age, as we see what's happening around us, it's humanity's chance to actually step forward and even surpass what we've seen in ancient history. That being said, I have no idea what will happen. And the way things are moving now, there's certainly a few options that could be. But that's my personal opinion. When I'm speaking about the Anunnaki, maybe it's a good chance to actually make this clear. I think a lot of people speak about these subjects with a lot of fear, or at least with a lot of urgency, with a sense of doom, with a sense of an enemy that is unbeatable and controlling us and has been for thousands of years. That's not the way I feel about it at all. I think that in the same way, banks today are these vast, megalithic constructions that decimate lives and control my life and everyone around me. I do think that it's not something that we need to fear. And personally, as is the same with all of these things, if we can for a moment go back to dimensions and try and tie it all together, this physical dimension that we experience, this physical body that we inhabit, all of it is both temporary and really fragile and constantly changing and unpredictable and somewhat random. I wouldn't say completely, but there are definitely unexpected turns. And that's part of what makes it worthwhile. But in terms of the doom and gloom, that only happens that only can take hold of us when all we focus about, when all we care about is the physical body and my personal life here as, Michael Olev. If we can think beyond that, if we can see the spiritual outlasting the physical, then suddenly the threat of death or of even, these terrible things that have happened to humanity throughout the years become much less frightening in my mind. And this slavery that we see around us, this prison system that seems to be binding everyone with invisible shackles, is much less unbeatable. And in my mind, at least, it becomes something more of both a challenge and an experience to help us learn and to move forward, rather than some, dead-end trap that we can never escape. So I think it's very, very important to talk about this. Maybe at the end of the Anunnaki and the nuclear holocaust and us being created as slave animals and all this very depressing history that we've gone through, it's definitely very important to say, first of all, this is the first time in history, I think, that human beings are so aware of all of these things. And in my mind, it's always better to be aware than not. When it comes to these matters, it's very frightening and sometimes depressing. The same as a lot of things, the same as finding out that I'm not, as good a person as I thought, and that I can be an asshole sometimes. That's never a fun thing to find out, but it's definitely better to find out, because then I can do something about it. And once I know about these prison systems in place, the way that our psychology has been shaped and works today, herd mentality, all of these dangerous things that human beings can get hurt by, it becomes much more possible for us to prevent it and to work against it and to be able to actually heal some of the problems and some of the divides that we have today. So that's my general message for all of these subjects. If ever you feel that it's too much depressing, that it seems like it's no way out and we're just trapped and we have nothing to do, I really don't believe that's the case. I believe we are here on a journey. We are constantly improving and learning more, and with what we are learning and experiencing, we can actually better ourselves and better deal with any challenges that we face in the future. Wow, that was a long ramble. I apologize for that. How are we doing on time? Okay, 11:47. Thank you very much, guys. It's so wonderful to be able to speak to people about these things and to hear what you know and what you've had to say. In fact, sorry, Richard mentioned a book for Claiborne, but Dream Yoga by Tenzin Wanganel. I haven't actually read that, but it's on my reading list for a long time now. There's a lot to read. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, that was a very quick one. Let me have a look very quickly and see what other question I had, because I think... Okay. So the questions that I had in general, since we're almost finished now, I think we'll be able to finish with this very quickly, I hope. One of them was, were they the only race to contact humanity? So we've sort of touched upon that, and we will get into that more later. And where are they today? The big one, which I think, sort of for me at least, and for most of the people that I mentioned these things, that seems to be the biggest thing of, okay, so we had these aliens, they've implemented this system. Where are they? What happened? Why did we go from like personal interaction and people flying on spaceships and sleeping with the gods to no one having any documented evidence whatsoever of them being around? And especially today, with more and more of the earth being discovered, obviously there's very little left now. It would be very interesting to think about how they could be here, as it were, or have they actually left? Well, again, this is going to be my personal opinion. I have to say that from what I know, and I'm not sure about his later work, it could be that I'm not up to date, but from what I know about Sitchin, he doesn't speak about where the Anunnaki are today. He does mention modern times. He does talk a lot about the Bible code, and he mentions a few things that prophecies, as it were, and these times that we're in as being important, but he doesn't actually specifically say where the Anunnaki are, to the best of my knowledge. So there's a few different versions, as it were, that we could mention. The first that we've spoken about is the dimensional theory, which is at any point the Anunnaki could possibly simply physically disappear from our dimension and we wouldn't know about it. Why would they do that? And, there are more questions to be answered with that, but that is a possibility. In my mind specifically, I think that what happened with the Anunnaki is that for most of them, they did actually leave Earth in our history. And the reason they did that was that from the start, there was a very specific reason for which they were here. And although a lot happened that they didn't expect, from what I have seen, there came a time when they actually decided that it was their time to go back to their planet. And I believe it has something to do with them being able to find a cure for the problems that they have with staying on Earth for so long. And not being able to go back biologically because they would get sick and they wouldn't survive. So the question is, did they all leave? Because at this point in the story, in our story at least, there are, hundreds of Anunnaki, and thousands of years later with more, assumed copulating, there must be many, many more. So the general theory is that they will come back. There is this feeling that the Anunnaki are sort of lying in wait somewhere, waiting for some point in the future, at which time they will return, to claim the Earth as their own or whatever it is. I don't believe that to be the case. I do believe that it's possible that certain members of the Anunnaki did stay on Earth, but very, very few, and I wouldn't mention names as I have no idea. But it seems that there are certain mentions of beings, aliens, gods, whatever, who could match that description, who remained on Earth later. As for their involvement, I think, in what's happening right now, from what I personally believe, the Anunnaki are no longer actually running things as it were. They were the ones who first established a lot of the systems that have survived to today. And thankfully or not, the human beings were actually capable of sustaining and keeping a lot of these systems in place and running and even improving upon them. Now, I will say that, in my opinion, there are other races who are involved with what's happening on Earth today, and they are very much part of these systems still. But as for the Anunnaki specifically, I believe that they played a role in our history that was much bigger, and as time moved forward, they actually took a step back. And interesting to see the parallel between that kind of twist in the Anunnaki story, where they sort of suddenly disappeared and aren't around anymore, versus the Judean belief of the Lord God, who was much more active and would come and smite the enemies, and would send angels who would interact with people, and again, a lot of these things which we've seen in the Anunnaki, and then has taken a step back. And in Hebrew, I can't remember the exact term, but sort of veiled his face, become hidden. And the Jewish faith today, which is so different from the biblical stories, is all around this different time in history when God will hide himself from the world and become less actively involved. In my personal opinion, if you have an established religion which is giving people, comfort and giving them morality and controlling them to behave, if you decide to leave that system, this is exactly the kind of technique that I would use to make sure that there's no panic. Just so you guys know, I'm going to be more hidden from now on. I'm still going to make sure you're okay. I'm still going to be watching. I'm still going to be punishing anyone who's out of line, but you just won't see me or hear me ever. And this seems to be, again, one of those sort of instances where we can see a very, not human, but, flawed thinking of trying to manipulate, posing as a god. So just a little nugget that I thought of. Okay, Richard asked, what do you think of Greer's new project of attempting to communicate psychically with aliens? That's not new. It's been going on for quite some time. He has a new documentary, I think, that's coming out, right? I love Richard Greer. I mean, first of all, he's a doctor. He's been through, the mainstream Western medicine, and he's come out the other end believing that spirituality has a lot to offer in terms of medicine. So anyone who has seen that, not just people who say, oh, you don't need medicine, you can, meditate and you'll be fine, but people who actually know and have studied and have seen and said, look, I've seen the patients this has helped. I personally have, had these experiences. I think he's wonderful. If you haven't heard of Richard Greer, if you're interested in UFOs, again, Richard Greer doesn't, to my knowledge, talk a lot about history and about anything beyond that. He talks about his experiences, which are really spiritual, psychic. Yeah, he calls them what does he call them? Does he call them psychic? I can't remember. But yeah, I call them spiritual, but non-physical communications with aliens, communications of the sixth kind. I think that's what it is, because there's the third kind. What is it? Contact of the third kind, contact of the fourth kind, contact of the fifth kind. I think Greer is fifth or sixth. I can't remember. Anyway, he's got a new... Yes, I think his work is very amazing. Angelica, thank you very much for joining. Are you still here? No, I think she left. Well, thank you for the message anyway. and like the CIA, stay behind programs. Yes, exactly. That's again my personal opinion, but growing up with the Judean God, where it was very, very famous and talked about that there was this period that God decided to sort of take a step back after, doing all of those things and causing all of those big events in history. Suddenly, with very little explanation, there is this huge shift, and now he's gone, he's out of the picture, and now we have these priests who are interpreting what he had to say. So it just feels for me like, something that needs to be pondered on. Okay, well, we've got exactly 3 minutes or 2 minutes left, I think, so we should probably start wrapping this up. First of all, before any of you leave, I would like to say again, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for staying this far in the episode if you have. I have to say, I am very excited about continuing with the next series. These subjects, for me personally, I think are very important to talk about. The Anunnaki and Sitchin's world is a very good basis, as I keep saying, but it can only take us so far. And so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty stuff. So I'm very excited. Rondon, let me know if Krim has a show after this. I hope she doesn't have any problems with the maintenance. I apologize for the sound and the quality and having things. I don't know why. Maybe it's the aliens, Maybe they don't think this podcast is a good thing. They're trying to stop the information from getting out there. So we'll show them. No, but I'm really sorry, and I hope that next week things will be a lot smoother. And that we'll have a new setup as well, because we're leaving Sitchin. Of course, you didn't see, for those who don't have the video, I put a picture of Sitchin because I thought, as this man has given us so much, we at least should be able to show his face. Richard Greer, right? Yeah, Rick Greer, Richard Greer. I believe it's Richard Greer, Dr. Richard Greer, and the first documentary was... I can't remember. What is it? It's a clever name. It's like a pun. Sirius. That's the one. Sirius. Rondon, thank you for that. Yes. But I still think we should blame the aliens, obviously. Yes, Disclosure Project. That's the term, the project. Right. Okay, how are we doing? Oh my gosh, that's it. I have to always remember to keep my eye on it. So thank you all so much. Stephen Greer. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Yes, Stephen Greer, of course. Well, on that note, thank you for joining me. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you all next week for another show. All right, bye for now.